Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rappin' with the Rep, a new and improved episode with our new set, and with Representative Jim Arciero from Westford, our neighbor in Westford, who is the House Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing. So welcome to our show.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Beautiful studio. Excited
you.
to be here.
Thank you. It's, Huntley and Brinkley want their studio back apparently.
I love it.
Yeah.
I think it looks great.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about housing, which is one of our greatest challenges here in Burlington.
Certainly.
We talk about this at town meeting. Recently, we're talking about we have a need for housing in the right place for various reasons. We have employers coming into town, and they're looking around, and they love access to our highly trained workforce. It's a great place to have business, but they don't know where to put their employees. Our seniors are challenged, our students are challenged, and you're challenged with finding answers to that.
Certainly.
As House Chair. So I know you recently had a very intense hearing on housing issues just last week. So let's start with that.
Yeah,
talk
absolutely.
About that
So thank you again for having me on.
Thank you for being here.
I became the chair. I think, Ken, we both became chairs
Right.
around the same time.
We did.
2021. And at that time, I grew up in Westford. I grew up in kind of I would say a rural area in comparison, or suburban area in comparison to some areas. I went to high school there, et cetera. I've been in office for 15 years, and we've seen a lot of changes in that time. I think for suburban individuals, I think a lot of things that we, over our time in office, even before that, we looked at things on zoning. We looked at issues of 40B. There was issues of NIMBY issues, expanding zoning, et cetera. So those were all issues that were very prominent with us. And interesting now, when the pandemic happened, became the chair of this, we had a lot of challenges during the pandemic. We had individuals that needed rental assistance across the state. We were able to work together during a period of time that was very difficult. We weren't actually present in formal sessions. We were remote, and sometimes we were in. But during that period of time, I became the chair of housing. And those issues weren't necessarily issues I dealt with in my district in terms of urban issues and Section 8 issues and affordability issues. Of course, that's everywhere. But certainly something that I think early in my career, we didn't have those same challenges, I think, that some of the urban reps did. During that period of time, during the pandemic, we were able to get almost $1 billion out for rental assistance for individuals and keep people housed during that period of time. I'm very proud of that. We were number 3 in the nation in getting the money out. And also, most importantly, we put some legal fixes in place with the Chapter 257 law, which essentially allowed to protect people when they had notice of eviction, to make sure that they could navigate through and have legal protections, that they wouldn't be thrown out of their house if they didn't have those legal frameworks in place. So those are some things that we did that were extremely important. But moving forward, I think it shed light on the idea that we were in a crisis before the crisis, and the crisis at the time was the pandemic, and the housing crisis has been there all along. Just last Thursday, I think you alluded to it, we had a housing hearing, a Joint Committee on Housing hearing, which was 11 hours long, and there are 300 people signed up to speak, and more than that signed up the day of. Certainly a long day, but I think a lot of people at home tuned into Governor Healy's State of the State last Monday. A big part of that, and something that she campaigned on and she's been certainly working towards, is getting our arms around the housing crisis. One of those pieces that we actually heard that day was Governor Healy's bond bill. And so what a bond bill essentially is a piece of legislation that bonds out construction projects predominantly to recapitalize our accounts to move forward with housing production across the state. We usually do this in a 5-year bond. The bond from 5 years ago is just about exhausted, and just to put into perspective, the enormity of the crisis, and certainly, to sort of meet the crisis at the moment, Governor Healy filed a $4.2 billion bond bill, which was double the amount of the bond bill that we've seen in our time in office, Ken, whether it's a number of different categories, an environmental bond bill, there's an IT bond bill that's coming, but this is a housing bond bill that deals specifically with production. The governor came first with HLC, Housing Livable Communities, Secretary Ed Augustus, and Lieutenant Governor to testify. And not only is this bill a little bit different, I would say Secretary Augustus put it, he put it in perspective, and that is the fact that it's double because our housing crisis is a lot larger than it ever was before. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that also is following with 28 policy provisions, which I don't think we have enough time in today's show to talk about all of them. But there are a number of policy provisions that, number one, I would say it's tools in the toolbox for communities, whether that's MBTA communities. There's auxiliary dwelling units by right is something he put in there to allow individuals to, have a more affordable place to live. In some cases, in a lot of cases, organizations like the ARC support auxiliary dwelling units because you're allowed to, stay and protect your disabled family, loved ones, individuals, your seniors to be able to, avoid a nursing home in some cases and stay with their loved ones. So it's an option that you're providing communities so far. But the big piece of this is the production piece.
Right.
And a large part, I think that in Bedford, certainly in Lexington, and certainly in Burlington, is our public housing authorities. There's 243 public housing authorities across the state. Right. What we've seen, especially during the pandemic, is sort of the crumbling infrastructure, if you will, of a lot of our housing authorities across the state, and ways that we can improve things, make things more sustainable, look towards having more longevity, looking towards a carbon neutral approach, if you will, with building and construction when it comes to public housing across the state.
Yeah, so I just want to put a little bit of a framework around the context of what we're discussing. So first of all, the governor comes out with a proposed bond bill.
Yeah.
And the reason that you had a hearing at all, let alone such an extensive one, is that now it's to the legislature to consider that bond bill.
Certainly.
And it doesn't mean that the legislature will advance everything in it. It doesn't mean that the legislature won't introduce things that are important to the House and eventually the Senate as well. But these bond bills are really legislative tools that the governor comes with her recommendations for as that first step.
Yeah,
right?
Typically the governor will file it, and which in this case she has. We hear the bill.
Right.
We had 11 hours of testimony, and certainly I have a meeting with the Speaker of the House next week to talk about some of the points in the bill that we want to analyze and underscore. I think there's when you have 28 policy provisions and hundreds of pages of a bond bill, there's certainly a lot of analyzing to do. But from that, we're going to send a version or the same version out of committee, and it will make a stop at the bonding committee as well, which specifically deals with the bonding capacity for the Commonwealth. Is there enough money to be able to bond this money out? That's something that has to be analyzed. Certainly, this is double the amount. We still don't have our arms around the bonding capacity for the Commonwealth before we actually move this bill forward. So let's just say, in easier terms, it would come to the House first. We would amend that language. We don't know if that bill will come out of Ways and Means, which sometimes makes that stop, or it will go directly to bonding to the floor. But then the Senate will have their debate on it too, and then that final product will go to the governor's desk this session.
Right.
We're very hopeful, and we will. And from that, makes her changes, her vetoes, her amendments, etc. And I don't know, Ken, this is a really interesting thing because we've had a number of bond bills through the history of our time in office. I've been in 15 years. You're 11?
Yeah, going on 12, right?
And I'm going on 12, and so I'm going on 16, my goodness. And in that period of time, I think we've never actually seen a bond bill that didn't have earmarks that didn't exceed the amount of the bond, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot. There's 160 legislators in the House. There's a lot of important projects that you want to get capitalized or certainly an earmark for within the bill. So you'll see a lot of that sort of maneuvering come those debates. And oftentimes the real piece of it is locally, regardless of the policy items that are inside it and regardless of the capitalization we do, for instance, for public housing. But a lot of it is going to be the earmarks that are important to the community and getting that money's released from the governor. That's an important piece. This money has to be released from the governor. So if Representative Gordon gets an earmark for Burlington, Bedford, and Lexington, which we know you will, you have to, at some point, that's where your real work goes, rubber hits the road in getting that money released from the governor to your community.
Yeah, because that is half the story.
Yeah.
One is authority that we give the governor to spend it, and the other is the decision
Certainly.
from the executive branch to follow up and do that, as opposed to when we pass a state budget in the spring going into the summer. That's actual money that that the governor has to satisfy.
Certainly, and we saw during, and that's bond money, right? But we saw real money in the production for, in the renovation and the modernization, if you will, for housing authorities across the state, because in the ARPA bill that we passed about a year and a half ago, we invested $600 million of cash into housing. One of those big pieces was $150 million for public housing authority. So on top of the increase that we gave on operating subsidies in this last budget and in their overall budget for the 243 housing authorities across the state, we also invested specifically cash to try to get housing authorities up to speed of where they were, especially during the pandemic. There was a lot of renovation issues. There was a time, I think, that it really underscored the need to improve our public housing stock across the state, and not just create and build, but also to improve what we have. And under this plan, we've heard this from housing advocates, but especially the governor's office, that the goal is to build 200,000 units over from 2020. You would take that time 2020, but 2024 to 2030,
Right.
to build 200,000 more units, and that's from the deeply affordable to the market rate. And I think a lot of people come to me, and I think we talked about this in the beginning of the show. How do you get your arms around this? Jim, is it more revenues? Is it policies on rent control? Is it the real estate transfer tax? Well, I look at this as a chair, and I think you do as well, is that we're keeping an open mind to everything, because all hands are on deck on this situation, and it's time really to visit and revisit things that we might not have looked at in the past. And I think on the housing piece, on the production piece, we're looking outside the box, more so I think on production than we did before. I have a great story, and I think it relates very well to your district as well, and that's the high-tech growth we've seen over the last 12 years. So in Westford, I was elected in 2008, middle of the subprime mortgage. Economic development was at a premium. Certainly, we had, it was Governor Patrick was in office at the time, and my particular area, which is the 110 corridor from Littleton all the way to the Chelmsford district, on that particular area became one of the fastest high-tech growing growth areas anywhere in the state. We were home to IBM's largest software lab in North America, 2,700 employees. Red Hat, over 800 employees. Puma's North American headquarters. NetScout, Juniper, a number of high-tech companies, which, obviously a lot of families came in the area because of that growth. What we saw during that period of time, unlike a lot of communities, and I think Burlington had a lot of this too, was a lot of ribbon cuttings, a lot more infrastructure improvements, not necessarily sexy infrastructure improvements, but needed to see more growth. When I drive anywhere and around Burlington now, it's almost unrecognizable
Right.
from what I remember as a kid going to the Burlington Mall, and especially what I remember in the last 5 or 6 years.
Even the mall is unrecognizable.
But one great interesting piece, I think, is the future of housing production is to repurpose office parks that are abandoned right now. And we have a perfect example in the town of Littleton. Littleton's about 12,000 people. During that period of time of high-tech growth and then moving into the pandemic, IBM closed shop. 2,700 employees were scattered either to North Carolina, Cambridge. They bought up Red Hat for $38 billion. Red Hat decided to move as well. NetScout is still stable, but they've lost employees. So we have abandoned parks all along the 110 corridor. A developer by the name of Sal Lapoli from Sal's Pizza, he is also an individual, he started that franchise, is also an individual who has developed a lot of, or repurposed a lot of mills in Lawrence, in the Merrimack Valley, and in Lowell in particular. He came to the Littleton Board of Selectmen, had a conversation about repurposing the IBM campus. To make a long story short, during this time in the pandemic and then moving out of the pandemic, Sal, or the developer, agreed with the Board of Selectmen in an eventual town meeting to develop this campus, which is 500,000 square feet, and is going to make 1,400 units of housing. And with that, we have Westford and Chelmsford having these same conversations now about how we can repurpose this space, this land. I know that you look at like the city of Lowell, other towns that are in my region or near my region, and it's a space issue.
Right.
It's trying to find places that you can to build, and I think in the suburbs we can lend a lot of assets and tools to the fight to create more housing.
Yeah, we have some office buildings that are well suited to convert to that. Burlington has done the same thing in certain areas. There are other buildings where for example, the windows, buildings that are kind of wide and long, where everyone needs to have windows, and so there's too much interior space. But there are other office uses or lab uses that can be made to purpose that and to help. And we've, in the legislature, we have appropriated funds to help to repurpose those otherwise empty buildings to find their best use. So it's important going forward. We've been talking about housing authorities, and just so that the folks understand, these are the areas where folks can live that are publicly owned, and they pay the rate that they can pay to live there. Not only do many of them need a lot of work, but the lines are extraordinarily long to get in. So a lot of seniors live there. The line is 5 years, 6 years long, and that's just unacceptable. And so the need for more housing.
The need for more housing, and in some cases, people, and I think individuals, I know I would feel this way too. You try to hyper focus on one sector of the economy or one sector of the population that needs housing over another. And there are those that people that need or deeply affordable issues. But on the top of that, it's just housing across the board. Our housing inventory is 200,000 less than we should be right now.
Right.
So essentially, we haven't done enough work in the last 10 to 15 years to repopulate our housing stock. We recapitalized at $1.8 billion. It certainly probably could have been $4 billion 5 years ago. But here we are, we're gonna meet the moment, and this is probably, it's the biggest once we're passed on top of what we did in the ARPA bill. And what's gonna be actually in this bill is $1.6 billion for housing authorities across the state on top of recapitalizing a number of accounts. It's the largest investment in the history of the Commonwealth for public housing.
Yeah. And with respect to creating opportunities for housing altogether, we've made steps in the last few years, for example, changing the law that now a majority vote is required for a zoning change.
Certainly, and housing choice, right, to kind of stop the logjam and have more inclusionary zoning and allow more individuals to have access. I think the MBTA communities is another example of tools in the toolbox. It has, and we kind of all knew this, right? There would be some bumps in the road.
Right.
The zoning there's 177 communities that are in MBTA communities, and then adjacent communities as well, right? And there's different zoning that has to be brought up. All three of my communities, one is direct in Littleton is MBTA zoning, and the other two are adjacent. Chelmsford isn't, and Westford's adjacent. But I'll tell you an example in Littleton is, well, and just for the edification of everybody at home, we essentially have to, those communities that are MBTA zoned, their zoning plans are in, and their deadline would be for another year to have the final zoning plan for the communities to start building. There's been some bumps in the road.
Right.
I know, I'll give you a perfect example. It's been the sort of distance, if you will, between where the half-mile distance radius, which has been difficult and challenging. I'll give you an example in Littleton. In Littleton, we're building 1,400 units at the 500 square foot parcel on King Street in Littleton, which is a little bit more than a mile away. And that's frustrating for people in Littleton because it's the largest project they've ever seen in their community, and they can't get that, they want to have that threshold counted. But I will say that the housing in livable communities has been really great with cities and towns, and meeting with cities and towns to help them achieve this and get to yes in their community. Littleton, just in fall town meeting, actually failed by 11 votes. So they're there, but there's still work to do, and they have more time to do it. And it's a big change. I mean,
It is a change.
I will say as a housing chair, but also as somebody who's been involved in the State House as an aide for 26 years, and 15 of them have been a legislator. I was in Senate Ways and Means
You
for a long time.
started when you were 8 years old.
I started a long time ago. But I remember sitting in the Gardner Auditorium, which is the largest auditorium that we have, and there was 400 people against 40B.
Right.
And 40B was essentially cities and towns had to reach 10% of affordability threshold, or they would be penalized by the state if they didn't reach it. And because of that threshold, a lot of communities hadn't reached their 10%. So therefore, it allowed developers to circumvent local control and build, in some cases, housing that wasn't something that they planned for or liked.
Right.
I just remember, Ken, 20 years ago being in a hearing room with 400 people. It was extremely hot. Now the last 2 sessions, I've been the housing chair. In the aggregate, in both hearings, 15 people.
On that same issue.
15 people.
Yeah. Yeah. Goes
And
to
so
show.
I think sometimes, there was the repeal 40B they wanted to do in 2010. And I think sometimes once you're doing the work and seeing the things that can improve your community and seeing things work and move forward, I think the anxiety kind of lessens a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we in our offices, and I'm sure you too, we get calls from families, our neighbors, our friends, families that also grew up together in our towns, that for circumstances that are beyond their control are just looking for housing. And to be able to find a small unit that's affordable to them makes all the difference in the world.
It certainly does.
And to have those opportunities and create those opportunities now that we see here in Burlington, and I know in Bedford, and I know in your communities too, it's a world of difference to not have to move to another area or another state, far away, because the cost of housing has so increased since a family first purchased their house.
Did you ever think the families would be $30,000, $40,000 priced out of where they thought they could afford? It certainly, we don't have the silver bullet for it all, but I really do believe that the bond bill and what the legislature will devise with, certainly with the talents of the 159 members of the legislature, adding their 2 cents when the bill is finally passed. I think we're going to be very proud of what we do, and I also think it's probably going to be, well, I know it'll be the most historically significant housing bill we've done in the history of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, you were referencing the booming economy that you have in your district, and here, the same thing. We've been very successful in attracting businesses from the life sciences and other areas like that. But the number one question we get is, where are we going to house our workers? If they come in with us, where are they going to live?
Yep.
Because we don't have a place to put them. And that's one of the few things that can stop the progress that we're making. And so the work that you're doing is so important to do that. And especially young people coming in. A lot of the life sciences are coming in and they're employing people, not only the people with the PhDs, but a lot of people who are making good money, but not the type of money now that are going to afford, $700,000, $800,000, $1 million home, nor do they want it. They're young people.
In the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, the business lobby for
Right.
the Commonwealth, for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the Mass Business Roundtable, another major business association and business lobby in the Commonwealth, they testified on Thursday, and that was their big concern. How do you attract companies to Massachusetts if you can't house them? You can't house the employees, and that is the biggest issue. And that's why it's an all hands on deck. Yeah, there's some policies. The real estate lobby is not excited about the real estate transfer tax. I know the MMA has some questions about auxiliary dwelling units and local control, but we're always going to have to work together and get our arms around things that are uncomfortable at first. But I certainly think in the long run they're going to pay heavy dividends.
Yeah, and it's important that we work as partners. And with our municipalities, we work together to get to the same goal rather than work against each other. And so with the MBTA Communities Act, yes, we require from those MBTA communities certain zoning for building as of right for residences. But we've got to really trust that these municipalities are putting zones that are buildable, where we
Certainly.
can move forward and actually accomplish that goal, because it doesn't really do anybody any good to move forward into our economy where, like I said in the beginning of the show, where our seniors can't stay here because there's no small unit for them to go to.
That's right.
Or they stay in their house too long because they can't go anywhere, and that's where the tear downs occur, because some people can't just keep up with the repairs after their career is over and things like that. Or our children coming back from school can't afford to come back. And where are they going to go? Far from us. So we're a better community as we work together to solve these issues.
Absolutely, and I also look at it this way, you know, and when you bring up, you know, seniors and affordability and students, increasing increasing the inventory is the first big step here.
Right.
You know, is to have more options, to have more availability, and then there wouldn't be as much of this price gouging, as you would say, with people trying to find a first place to live, an apartment to live in. I mean, you know, I'm sitting through this hearing the other night. And I said the other night because I went to 10 o'clock at night,
Right.
and I'm thinking and I'm listening to young people tell me about their rents being $2,700 for a one bedroom.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that's like way more than my mortgage. And my wife and my daughter, we live in a modest house in Westford. It's an expensive place to live. But, you know, that's when you don't have and you're not secure about where you're sleeping every night and that your family's protected, you know that there has to be something that we can do as human beings, is to figure out a way to get our arms around this crisis. And I think this bill is a big step towards doing that. Does it solve everything? Absolutely not. But again, it's the biggest investment in the history of the Commonwealth. One thing I wanted to touch on, because I know that housing choice is something that you've known a lot about in this district over the years, or I should say the Mass Works program. But the Secretary and the Governor put forward something called Housing Works. And so in the past, I think the Mass Works program was economically driven. So it would be a number of different projects that spur the economy and that helps your community. But and under this bill, they've set aside something specifically called the Housing Works program that's just for housing projects. And that's specifically what they're going to focus on. I think in the past, we didn't have a housing secretary. We had a housing of economic development and housing.
Right.
So, you know, they were split. And of course, they're both at the intersection of each other. But we understand, and I think the governor did, that it's important that we have a housing secretary that focuses some of those investments specifically on housing production.
And so that the folks understand what you're saying, the MassWorks grant, especially here in Burlington, has been so effective most recently because Burlington had a need to hook up to the MWRA. And so we were able to get assistance through grant funding, $3.5 million, because the folks here saw signs going up every summer, you can't water your lawn. Businesses were challenged because they need water, and the life sciences absolutely need access to water. That's really central to what they do. So we were able to help that way. So this would be the government coming in and doing what one individual business can't do.
That's right.
The government, right? The government provides the road in front of the business to get products to market. The business is the one that creates the product, and they need each other
Certainly.
to create the economy.
Yeah, certainly.
So to do that for housing would be so important.
It is, and you know, and again, it's you know, the game has changed, and we need to adapt too. And I think that's why we have tools in the toolbox and monies towards, you know, expanding production. And one other thing I wanted to talk about that's in the bill too, that kind of goes unnoticed, because there's so much focus on building new housing. There's so much focus on recapitalizing the programs like the Commonwealth Builder programs for gateway cities, or the Housing Works program. But also the supportive housing funding pool is in this piece. And essentially what supportive housing is, and I know a lot of your friends that you know, work in the advocate space and certainly social workers at the senior center would know about this. And this is monies that are set up for individuals, typically individuals who are chronically homeless or have substance abuse issues or have health issues, disabled individuals. It is to have wraparound services 24 hours in supportive housing units. We were able to put in this year's budget and then the ARPA bill about almost $200 million to the construction of supportive housing. I've been able to tour them across the state. It's amazing to be able to have individuals who have the needs that they have to have met in a safe space to eventually move out to you know, normal living once they move out from shelters to supportive housing to you know, a fulfilled life.
Right. Without these transitional centers, they go right back into the problems that led them.
That's exactly
into
right.
trouble.
And so this language, although subtle, that's in this bill too, would establish this pool of money to create predictable wraparound services for supportive housing across the Commonwealth.
Well, there's a lot there. And I appreciate your visit, because the idea behind this whole show was to introduce the decision makers to the
Yeah.
people from Burlington and Bedford, so that they can see for themselves how government works.
Yeah,
And how
absolutely.
we're trying every day to do our best to make life better for our residents. And so I appreciate you coming on.
That was great. And I know,
sharing
you
your
know, we
time.
only sort of hit the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to talk. I'll have to come on another time and things get a little bit closer.
Well, thank you very much. I
Thank you
appreciate it.
very
I'm going
much.
to take you up on that opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Representative
Representative.
Arciero, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks
All
for
right,
coming on.
Representative.
Everybody, thank you. See you next time on Rapping with the Rep.